Welcome back, fans of Gary Lewis and the Playboys. Last time we took a look at their debut album, 1965's This Diamond Ring. And even though I'm getting sick and I'm losing my voice, and I'm hoping I can get through this entire video, I said, you know what, when there's another album to review, just count me in. Because today we have to review their second LP, from August of 1965, a session with Gary Lewis and the Playboys. Before we begin, an extra special thanks to Watcher Tall Paul in Kentucky. Left some very helpful and useful comments on my last video about this diamond ring. Really helped me set some stuff up for this video, so I appreciate that, Tall Paul. Thanks again. So this diamond ring, the subject of the last video in this series, peaked at number 26 on the Billboard Top LPs chart. Not too shabby for a debut opening. Of course, the title single went all the way to number 1, so that was a big help. You might remember the blurb on the back of the album talked about how this was recorded very quickly and how the Playboys went from being, kind of supporting musicians at Disneyland to all of a sudden being major recording stars. So, a session with Gary Lewis and the Playboys sort of picks up where this left off. Remember, we're still in the mid-60s where popular groups can release 2, 3, 4 LPs of music a year. And indeed, as This Diamond Ring was released in the spring, a session with Gary Lewis and the Playboys was released in late summer. This time, the blurb is much more about their film and TV appearances than it is about how quickly the album was assembled. And interestingly enough, we don't get a ton of mentions of Jerry Lewis. This diamond ring was very heavily marketed as, hey, Gary Lewis, he's the son of Jerry Lewis. You saw him on TV. But this one, on the other hand, while it still does cash in on Jerry Lewis's name, it mentions the group's individual merits far more than the previous blurb did. I should also add that the title, A Session with Gary Lewis and the Playboys, bit of a misnomer. It's not like we have session outtakes here. It's not like we have spoken word banter between tracks or anything like that. This isn't like Beach Boys' Party or the Beatles' Let It Be or something like that. It's really a pretty regular album. They could have called it Count Me In or Save Your Heart for Me or Concrete and Clay or anything else, and it would have worked just as well. So don't be fooled by the title. In terms of their studio albums of new material, A Session with Gary Lewis and the Playboys was the highest charting LP the group had, peaking at number 18. One of those things that Tall Paul pointed out to me that he is most correct about, their highest charting album was actually their first hits package. We will get to this someday, and we'll discuss this set here. But for now, we're going to focus on the album at hand. So, did find an audience, was well liked by fans. In the back again, it mentions a lot of their TV appearances. You might notice a little something that differs this album from This Diamond Ring, and that is we have one fewer Playboy. Here's Gary in 3 of the Playboys, but on the last record, if you looked at any of the photos, he was usually with 4 Playboys. So, without going into too much detail, because personnel isn't always my thing, especially when they seem to change as quickly as the Playboys did, was that throughout 1965, Gary Lewis lost and gained many different backing musicians. Some went on to individual fame like Carl Radle, but for the most part, a lot of them kind of wandered in and wandered out again. So we see some familiar faces, but certainly not all of them. Again, we're short one Playboy, something a little bit different. The back of this record also makes a big deal about promoting the new movie that he's making called The Family Jewels. I've never actually seen The Family Jewels. I ought to look that up. So you might remember that the last album, This Diamond Ring, pretty much all covers, with just 2 exceptions. And most of the covers didn't do a whole lot with the original material. A few did. Again, their version of This Diamond Ring caught on when Sammy Ambrose's did not. I kind of liked their more juvenile spin on Joel Aiken's The Birds and the Bees, but for the most part it felt like a lighter version, especially songs like The Kinks' All Day and All of the Night. Gary Lewis The Playboys, take all the grit and all the grime off of that song and make it the most sterile thing imaginable. And we see a lot of the same stuff here, but not entirely. I think I like the selection of songs they chose to cover a little bit better. So let's get into it with the major song on the album, and the one I mentioned at the beginning of the video, their new hit single, Count Me In. Count Me In went all the way to number 2. Written by pianist Glenn Hardin. He has a pretty impressive resume. He apparently came in, and when producer Thomas, aka Snuff Garrett, was working on the next big Gary Lewis hit, he played this song, and Snuff Garrett fell in love with it immediately, and it indeed became Gary Lewis and the Playboys' next hit. Count Me In, really fun song. I would argue that those who don't think that this Diamond Ring is the group's signature song, this is probably the one they would pick. There are a couple other possible choices too. But definitely a big hit for the group, and established them as, consistent hit makers. This was their second major single, and peaking at number 2 certainly was nothing to be ashamed of. Apparently everyone was a bit upset it didn't go to number 1, but 2 number 1s in a row, that can be a bit tricky. So I think they all were okay with number 2. Pretty fun song though, and one that pops up on all those hits packages and collections and so on. So Count Me In, a strong start. Interestingly, the rest of the first side of the record is all covers, and most of them follow the originals pretty closely. We have a cover of Ricky Nelson's Travelin' Man, which, it's a close copy, but it definitely replaces kind of the sensual nature of Ricky Nelson's vocal with a bubblegum vibe. Concrete and Clay by the British group Unit 4+2. Gary Lewis and the Playboys stripped out a lot of the kind of mariachi Latino feel of the song and did it much more directly. They do a nice job on it, but again, you can tell they didn't do a whole lot with it. They didn't really try anything new. They have the Everly Brothers, Walk Right Back, which have been a big hit. A very short song, and one that, wastes no time. Gary Lewis and the Playboys don't really have the harmony the Everly Brothers do, but they do a pretty serviceable job on it at the end of the day. It's a little bit rowdier, I would say, than the Everly Brothers version is. We have the Yardbirds' For Your Love. This, of course, was famously one of the songs that made Eric Clapton leave the Yardbirds. They copy it pretty closely, but they don't keep any of the roughness or the grit that the Yardbirds' original had. It's done very lightly, for your love, that kind of thing. And I don't know, it works, I guess, as kind of a nice change, but it is nowhere near the power of the original. And lastly, on the first side, we have Gary Lewis and the Playboys' signature cover, Save Your Heart for Me. Every group has at least one cover that they've basically made their own. The Beatles have Twist and Shout, the Beach Boys have Barbara Ann, a song that's so associated with one group, we forget it's even a cover. And that would definitely be Save Your Heart for Me for Gary Lewis and the Playboys. Brian Hyland had recorded the song back in 1963. His version was just an album track and then later a B-side. Didn't do much. Gary Lewis and the Playboys don't really change a whole lot about the song. Gary Lewis whistles at the beginning to replace the whistler in the original one. But for the most part, it's a pretty close copy. But for some reason, maybe just the timing was right or the promotion was good, because Save Your Heart for Me went all the way to number 2 on the charts for Gary Lewis and the Playboys. So definitely worked out, and that became the big cover that they were known for. So even though we have 2 LPs that are predominantly covers, if you had to pick their signature one, that would be the one to pick. And it is a beautiful song. I think Brian Hyland's version has a little more heart and soul to it. But Gary Lewis and the Playboys, they go for more like a buoyant, kind of sunshine, bubblegum vibe. And that actually suits the song, I think. For young lovers, they would probably want something more like that. If you flip the record over, we get a song that is much covered. Freddie Cannon's Palisades Park. Liberty recording stars Jan and Dean had done their version not long before. We'll talk more about Jan and Dean here in a second. You can see the Liberty logo up there. Again, a pretty close cover. Admittedly, Gary Lewis and the Playboys version does not include any amusement park sound effects, roller coaster tracks, people yelling, that kind of thing. But they still manage, most of the same vibes. Unpopular opinion, the best version of Palisades Park is the Beach Boys one from the 70s. The one that nobody likes but me, that kind of thing. But I do enjoy Gary Lewis's version here. We have, for the first time, Gary Lewis getting a writing credit on the song. The next one up there, without a word of warning, she'll break your heart. Do 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 do. So Without a Word of Warning was the first time, again, that he'd gotten a songwriting credit and was a completely original tune for the Playboys, not intended for any other artist or written for them. It was the B-side to Save Your Heart for Me, so a popular single, having a popular B-side. According to the liner notes in some of the CD books, we talked before about the This Diamond Ring session with Gary Lewis 2 for CD, and my very battered copy of the complete Liberty singles. Apparently Liberty's policy on 45s was there was one strong song on the A side that was pushed by the publicity department and by the artist, everyone else, and the B side was just whatever. Preferably something original and cheap. It was kind of the throwaway. They weren't fans of the double A side idea that we see groups like the Beatles or CCR embrace. It was A-side's big money maker, B-side is the free ride, as it was called in one of the two booklets. I think it was this one that came with the CD. So, at the end of the day, it's nice to have a B-side here, and I like that it's an original tune, which I'm sure was done to cut back on royalties and so on, but honestly, a pretty strong song in its own right. Without a Word of Warning pops up on a lot of Gary Lewis hits packages, and so on. So it's not a weak song, even though it was kind of written and created as a throwaway. It could have just been an exercise to get Gary Lewis into like a writing phase. You know, he collaborated with other people who were more experienced and so on to kind of give him a leg up in case the Playboys really took off. Then he'd be able to write original songs for them. We have Bobby Goldsborough's Voodoo Woman, again copied very, very closely. I would say probably the closest copy of all the covers on the album. It's a nice, fun song to do, and it gets, as you can see, pretty prominent billing up there, but there's really not a whole lot to say about it. If you listen to Bobby Goldsborough's version, you've basically got it there. We have an original. We only saw 2 originals, I think, on the original album. There were a couple that could have been covers, but I couldn't locate an original artist. Same case here with the song Free Like Me, also written by Glenn Hardin, who gave us Count Me In, kind of the lead song for the LP there. This must have been one that no one was super impressed with, or maybe nobody thought would go anywhere. It was just kind of stuck on here near the end. It's a decent song. It's nothing spectacular, but at the same time, it certainly beats yet another cover. And not really too terrible there. Not sure why it got shunted all the way back here. We follow that up with Little Miss Go-Go. Little Miss Go-Go is one that actually remains pretty popular. It was another one of those throwaway B-sides, in this case the B-side to Count Me In, and actually written kind of as an homage to Jan and Dean. You know, this is a song about getting the girl, Little Miss Go-Go, and going to a hot rod race and the beach and having a dance party and that kind of stuff. And apparently it was written sort of as a parody, but it doesn't come off as overly satiric or anything like that. But to kind of comment on how those sorts of songs, those beach party songs from the early 60s were becoming passé. You know, Jan and Dean were falling off the charts, I'd say, at least noticeably by this point. The Beach Boys, of course, were trying to revamp their image in 1965 and so on. So having this song that was deliberately kind of an archaic throwback as the B-side seemed intentional. It's fun enough, and despite the title, Little Miss Go-Go, it doesn't have any super uncomfortable lyrics. We mentioned Sweet Little Rock and Roller in the last episode that hasn't aged very well necessarily, so this one avoids most of that. Not a terrible song by any means. And we finish off this album with a song. And I wonder, I wonder why they picked Runaway, a run, 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 my runaway. I'm sick, I can't hit those high notes, you know. But anyway, Runaway, Del Shannon's signature song. On their first LP, they did Del Shannon's last big hit, which was Searchin', also known as Keep Searchin', or We'll Follow the Sun. And so here they do Del Shannon's signature tune. Of course, Runaway. And lots of other groups have done Runaway. I've talked about both the Beach Boys versions on this channel before. Gary Lewis and the Playboys don't do a whole lot with it that's unique, except for this huge organ solo in the middle that goes absolutely ballistic. I don't know if I like it or if it's a little too weird, but at least it's noticeable and it makes the song, kind of stand out. Runaway, classic rock standard, you really couldn't go wrong with that. And that wraps up their second studio LP here, a session with Gary Lewis and the Playboys. Despite being predominantly covers, this one feels a little more ambitious. They pick some trickier songs or some songs that were maybe a little bit out of their wheelhouse. And even though they stuck with mostly a juvenile, bubblegum, kind of calm approach that presumably anybody would be comfortable with, kids, parents, whomever, at the end of the day, I still feel like the group hasn't quite come into their own. But we have more LPs coming up with a lot more different songs on them. Please leave your comments on Gary Lewis and the Playboys and this album below. Always look forward to seeing those. Hopefully next week I have my voice back as we talk about the Marx Brothers. And until then, my friend, go out there and save your heart for me. Or if not for me, for someone else. That's fine too.